Welcome to the overview of Chapter 3 as we look here in AP Microeconomics at supply and demand. Thanks for joining me. Hope you find this helpful. What are we going to look at in this chapter? We're going to look at the supply and demand model based on perfect competition. We'll explain what that is. We'll also look at the supply curve and demand curve, why they are upward and downward sloping, what happens when we see equilibrium among them, movements of those curves and why those take place, how we find an equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, and then what happens in the event that the market isn't in equilibrium. What happens in that scenario when it isn't in that the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity in perfect competition. We end up with a shortage and a surplus, so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. All right, so let's start with the competitive market. In perfect competition, when it comes to supply and demand, we're looking at buyers and sellers in which they are selling the same good. They're selling the same product. Notice I put a picture of corn here. Why? Because this is a good example of an item or a good that is sold in perfect competition. In seeing this, you don't know who produced it, you don't know who sold it, you don't know where it was in terms of where it was produced, and it is a commodity. It is something that can be bought and sold by many people and be bought by many people, be sold by many people. This is the idea of a perfect model. A perfect competition model in supply and demand. So we use the supply and demand model, ceteris paribus everything else, to demonstrate 5 key elements. This idea of demand, the downward sloping demand curve. As the price falls, the quantity demanded increases. The supply curve, as the price goes up, the quantity supplied will increase, leading to an upward sloping supply curve. What happens when these curves shift to the left or to the right, shift inward or outward, rightward or leftward? And what happens when we find market equilibrium and changes to that market equilibrium? What happens to price? What happens to quantity? And we'll see a lot of these in some key graphs, some really very demonstrative key graphs in this chapter showing you the impact that is taking place on price and quantity, and we'll talk through those in some detail. So let's start with the demand schedule. This is the idea that when goods and services are sold, what is demanded in terms of the quantity that is demanded is actually based on price. So if the price is lower, the quantity demanded is actually higher. Notice 14.2 billion pounds of cotton are demanded at a price of 50 cents, where only half of that, 7.1 billion pounds of cotton, are sold at a price of $2. So this shows us a demand schedule that is downward sloping. The idea here is that as the price drops, the quantity demanded will increase, leading to this downward sloping curve that we see here. So this is the graphical representation. Again, ceteris paribus, everything else. We're looking through the telescope lens to see a downward sloping curve of the demand curve. The idea that a good or service, as the price rises, the quantity demanded will fall, and as the price falls, the quantity demanded will actually rise. Now, an increase in demand due to the population increase is actually something that will shift the curve. And this is a good example of where the price stays the same, but the quantity demanded actually increases because of the fact that there's more people demanding these products, because of the population increase over the course of these 3 years. So from 2007 to 2010, we can see there's a significant increase in population, and as a result of this, there's a significant increase in the quantity demanded of cotton. And so even though the prices stay the same, the quantity demanded of cotton at $2 actually increases by 1.4 billion pounds. And this is significant to demonstrate not just the downward sloping demand curve, but now a shift in that demand curve. Because of the increase in population, we now see a demand curve that is at D2 rather than D1, and this is because of that population. Now, there are other factors that will shift the curve here as well, but what we're seeing here is a demand curve shift rightward or outward as a result of this increase in population. What it also means is that all of the individual price and quantity points that we saw on D1 have now moved to D2. So at the price point, the price points haven't changed, but the quantity demanded at those price points have changed because of the shift, because all of those points on D1 have now moved rightward or shifted rightward to D2, and that's what we're seeing here, all as a result of that shift in population. Now, let's just break down the difference here. So movement along the curve versus a shift of the curve are two very different things. When price goes up or price goes down, we see quantity demanded changes. This is leading to what we see at point A and point B, a movement along the curve. That's just basically a price change that leads to more quantity being sold or demanded because of the price dropping. And that's going to move along the curve. That's never going to shift the curve. Price is not a shifter. Price is only a movement along the curve. And it's important to keep that in mind as we move forward. Now, a shift of the curve is going to involve a number of factors, determinants of demand that we'll take a look at in a moment in a mnemonic device to help with that. But a shift of the demand curve then, or an increase in demand, is going to shift that curve outward or rightward. A decrease in demand is going to shift that curve leftward or inward. And the mnemonic that we use in this is what merits a shift in demand. This idea of thinking what merits demand is going to be the driver here. And the first one is market size. If your market expands, the number of consumers available to your market expands, then that demand curve is going to shift outward. If the market size shrinks for some reason, then the market size is going to shift the demand curve inward or leftward. Same thing with expectations, especially future expectations. The expectation of what's going to happen in the industry is set. If that changes, those changes in expectations for moving forward would affect the demand curve. You expect that there's going to be broader markets, and there aren't all of a sudden. There are fewer markets. That's going to shift the demand curve inward or leftward. Likewise, the related prices of related goods, not the price itself of the good we're looking at, but prices of related goods like substitutes and complements. Substitutes being something you replace the good you want to buy with because the price is too high. So you're going to shift to a substitute instead. This is the idea of no-name brand cola versus Pepsi or Coke. If the price of Pepsi and Coke rises, you're going to shift to a substitute. That is going to change the demand for this substitute. And it's not the price that changes it, it's the price of the substitute that changes the demand for that item. Same thing is true with complements. If you have hot dog buns and hot dogs, if the price of hot dogs goes up, chances are the demand for hot dog buns is actually going to shift inward or leftward. Why? Because the price of hot dogs went up. More people are looking at that and saying, hey, I'm not going to buy hot dogs if the price of hot dogs is going up, therefore I don't need the buns. So I'm not going to buy those. So demand shifts leftward or inward. And then income, number 4. Income being normal, that can shift demand outward. If people have more money to spend, more disposable income, they spend more and they're looking to spend more, that's going to shift the demand curve outward or rightward. Whereas if it's inferior income, I've been laid off from my job, I've been let go, businesses have closed, those types of things lead to a demand curve shifting inward or leftward because demand isn't as strong as it once was when we were originally looking at this demand curve. And then the last one is taste and preference. This idea of marketers and advertising basically trying to win us over and make us crave a product that we didn't necessarily think we needed, but creating a taste and preference that shifts that demand curve. And a really good advertising campaign can do that. A really good message that is sent out there to the general public. And we've seen all of those, especially during Super Bowl commercials. We've seen an attempt at shifting taste and preference. And this is what we mean by shifting that demand curve rightward or outward. But keep in mind, price is never going to be a demand shifter. And spoiler alert, it's also never going to be a supply shifter. Price does not shift curves, okay? It only moves the quantity along the curve, quantity demanded or quantity supplied. Price is never going to shift the demand or supply curve as a result of what we see here. Now, just to break it down, again, substitutes, the idea here is you have two goods in a marketplace. One is the good of choice. The other one is the backup. That's the substitute. And if the price of the substitute drops to a point that your good is overpriced, then the demand for your product, because of the change in the substitute price, the demand for your product could shift leftward or inward. Likewise, if the price of the substitute goes up, that could shift the demand for your product outward. Why would I buy no-name brand cola when it's almost just as much as Pepsi or Coke? This is the idea of the change in related prices impacting the demand curve for your product. The same is true for complements, as I mentioned with the hot dogs and the hot dog buns, and we see that if the price of one good goes up, chances are the demand for the other good is going to shift inward or leftward because of what we see there. And then changes in income, like I said, with normal goods, the idea here is when income is going up, the demand will shift outward. When you have inferior goods or inferior income, you have a shift of the demand curve inward or leftward as a result. And then the tastes and expectations that we just referred to. So the market demand curve is horizontal when we see this in terms of the adding up of the individual curves. So think of this like A plus B equals C. And A plus B is really representative of all of the individuals in the marketplace that are demanding particular products at particular price points. That's what we see in part C. We see the market demand curve here that is basically all of the individual demand curves added up into C, which is the market demand curve. So all of those price points are indicative and indicated in this downward sloping demand curve, which is what we see here. So think of it as the horizontal sum. You're adding together all of these price points at 30, and the market demand curve is whatever that quantity is at 30. Same is true of the others. So A plus B equals C is a great way to remember that. And we get to our third key graph, which is the demand curve. This is the idea, again, what merits demand is going to shift the curve from D to D1, going outward or rightward. If it were moving inward or leftward, we would see the arrow going in the other direction. D1 would be on the left side instead of on the right side. And the idea here is it is downward sloping because of the law of demand, because of the idea that as a price falls, the quantity demanded will increase. As a price rises, the quantity demanded will fall. Now, that takes us to that clarifies the demand side. Let's look at the supply side for a second. So if demand is downward sloping, we know supply is going to be upward sloping because they essentially form an X, an X, and the point in the middle where both of those intersect is going to be our equilibrium. But we'll get to that in just a second. The idea here is this is a supply schedule for cotton. Again, we talked about demand schedule for cotton. This is how much producers are actually going to make when the price changes. This is what we call quantity supplied. And notice that the law of supply tells us that if the price of a good goes up, the quantity supplied will also go up. If the quantity supplied goes down, then the quantity supplied, the price of the good goes down, the quantity supplied will also go down. Price and quantity supplied are moving in the same direction. We didn't see that in the demand schedule, but we do see that here with the supply schedule, and that's going to create the upward sloping supply curve that we see. So as a result of this, when the price rises, supply will also rise. And this is the profit motive at work. Businesses want to make money. They have incentives to do so. And in order to make this happen, they are looking for prices to rise. As those prices rises, the quantity supplied will also rise in terms of what we see here. So this gives way to the upward sloping supply curve that we see here. Now, we also know that over time, new innovations take place, new technologies are formed, and this is one of the most common ways to shift the supply curve. We talked about shifting demand based on increasing population or increasing markets. The improved technology is another method of a really popular one in terms of why supply would shift or increase or shift the supply curve to the right. Again, upward sloping, but still shifting rightward or outward. New technology, same price points, but notice we can produce more after the new technology is implemented. New technology, and by this way, this doesn't mean just, computers and internet access. New technology is also new ways of doing things, new ways to do things more innovatively, faster, cheaper, less complicated, with less regulation and that sort of thing. All those things can shift the supply curve to the right. And we see here that based on these price points, which aren't changing, the new technology is what's changing. That's shifting the curve and moving it outward like we see here. So before the new technology, we're at S1, the upward sloping S1 curve. After the new technology is implemented, we see we are at the S2 curve. All of those points on S1 have now moved to S2. And the price points are the same, but the quantity that's being supplied has changed due to that new technology. So again, here it's important to point out the movement along the supply curve versus a shift in the supply curve. Same as what we talked about with demand curve. When we have a change in price that leads us to produce more, that is a change in the price along the curve. It's only moving along the curve. It is not shifting the curve itself. So a movement along the supply curve is going to be what we see from point A to point B. The price of a good goes up. The movement along the curve in terms of quantity supplied is also going to increase because businesses want to make more money. And if they see that more money is being paid out there for this item, they're going to want to produce more because they can make more. Versus this shift from A to C, which is this idea of new technology shifts the curve because the game has changed. Now we find more ways to be innovative. And there is a mnemonic to go along with this as well called think trice for supply. And we'll look at that here in just a second. So increase in supply, a shift outward or rightward of the curve. It's a positive effect that is taking place in the business world in terms of allowing them to do more with less. And produce more product. A decrease in supply would be a leftward or inward shift going from S1 to S3. This is a decrease in supply moving inward, and this would be setbacks or challenges when it comes to implementing technology. Bugs, viruses, those types of things that could slow technology down would shift the curve inward or leftward, leading to a smaller quantity that is supplied as a result of all of the points along the S3 curve. So what is going to shift the supply curve then? Well, we mentioned technology as the first one. Let's talk about the others. Again, we use the mnemonic think trice for supply or think trice for a shift in supply. Technology is going to shift that curve leftward or rightward. Related prices are also going to do so. This is also complements in production and particularly government actions. What government is going to do in terms of regulating, in terms of taxation, in terms of subsidies provided to industries, all of these things, if they benefit the company, it's going to shift the supply curve rightward. If they negatively impact the company, it would shift the supply curve leftward. So for instance, if you raise taxes on businesses, that's going to shift the supply curve inward because businesses are being negatively impacted by an increase in taxes. If you were to cut taxes, that would shift the supply curve rightward or outward because lowering that burden on businesses is going to allow them to put that money into more supply. The same is true of subsidies. If government increases subsidies to businesses, they're giving them more money to do more things with. That's going to increase the supply curve. If they cut those subsidies, that would move the supply curve inward or leftward. And that's really where we see government involvement in terms of shifting supply. In these senses. In number 3, we look at inputs, the availability of resources and the price of those resources. Here is where price of the inputs are determinants of supply shifting. But remember, price of the good itself is not going to shift supply. It's only going to move the quantity supplied along the curve. But an input, a resource, if it costs you more money to pay your workers, if it costs you more money to create these products, those are input prices. And that is going to shift the supply curve leftward or inward if those prices are going up. It's going to shift the supply curve rightward or outward if the input price is actually dropping, because they're able to do more with less. Competition, if there are more sellers out there, more producers, more businesses that are participating in creating product, that may not necessarily be good for your company, but it's great for the supply curve because what that means is there's more supply out there. So if there are the number of sellers increases, that is going to shift the supply curve outward or rightward. By reducing the number of sellers, they go out of business, whatever happens to them along the way, that's going to move the supply curve inward as a result of that. And then the last one is changes in expectations. When suppliers have expectations of what is going on and those change all of a sudden, that can shift the supply curve too. You think that they're going to come out with a new product and then they don't come out with a new product and instead they have to go back and fix the old one. Those are changes in expectations. That shifts the supply curve inward versus the supply curve that is there all of a sudden the company says, we're changing expectations through new technologies and we're changing our expectations because we can now do more with these products. So a lot of times expectations is tied to one of the other four in terms of a shift in supply, but this does have an impact in terms of that. So what we see here again, A plus B equals C. The market supply curve is upward sloping, and it includes all of A and all of B. Again, the horizontal sum of those items that's going to take you to the market supply curve that we see here. And that leads us to key graph 4. The upward sloping supply curve, a shift in the curve is going to move the entire curve from S to S1 versus a movement along the curve, which would not shift the curve. It would just move to a point on the S curve that we see here. And that is a change in quantity supplied, not a shift of the curve itself. So again, think trice for supply. That's going to help you tremendously, and it'll go a long way. Okay, so we have supply, we have demand. Let's now look at putting it all together. The idea of finding equilibrium, a market clearing price. We have upward sloping supply curve, we have a downward sloping demand curve, and we're trying to find where that X meets in the middle. That's our equilibrium. That's our market clearing price. And that's also our market clearing or equilibrium quantity as a result. We can see the price point at which people are willing to buy and the price point at which people are willing to sell. We're also able to see the equilibrium quantity at which people are willing to buy and the quantity at which people are willing to sell. So this is point E that you see here, or the equilibrium. It should be labeled as point E. And then that is going to lead us to an equilibrium price, in this case $1 a pound, and an equilibrium quantity of, in this case, 10 billion pounds of cotton. So this is the intersection of supply and demand, and that leads us to our fifth key graph on perfect competition. Notice upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve. Our vertical axis is labeled P for price. Our horizontal axis labeled Q for quantity. And notice we then draw lines for the price and quantity at this equilibrium. So we have a price level of P1 for this particular competitive market and a quantity of Q1. This is the idea that at the upward sloping supply curve and downward sloping demand curve meeting at equilibrium, they are meeting at a price of P1 and a quantity of Q1. This is allocatively and productively efficient. We're able to produce all of our resources without having extra, without having leftovers, and we're able to do this efficiently in terms of allocating all of those resources so that there's nothing left over and there are no shortages. And likewise, we have no surpluses, we have no shortages, we have used all of our resources effectively, and there is no extra, there is no shortage. We are allocatively and productively efficient in doing so. So if you're not in that situation where you have this perfectly allocatively and productively efficient manner, we would get to what we call a surplus if you have a gap. And we'll talk more about this in the next chapter in terms of surpluses and shortages. But if there is a price that is instituted in which something is happening that is leading to a higher price in the market, the quantity supplied is going to be increasing in terms of pushing out more product, but the demand isn't there. And so at that price point, people aren't going to buy. So you're going to have more product available than you have people demanding or consumers demanding that product. So you're going to have what's called a surplus, a gap between what is being supplied in the marketplace at that price and what is being demanded at that price. And that's going to lead to a surplus. Now, in situations where you have live product, such as milk from dairy farmers, or you have meat from hogs, or something along those lines, or paper from paper mills, you're going to have what's called obsolescence. You can't keep those products forever. So you really don't want to produce those goods or harvest those materials until you're sure that you're meeting at equilibrium. And that's why this is so important, because if you have a surplus and you have, 1 million pounds of, in this case, you have 3.1 billion pounds of cotton that have been picked, but nobody wants them. It's probably a little easier to sit on the shelf, but even still, it's aging. Paper, you don't want that to happen. Milk, you certainly don't want that to happen. And so you can see the problem that ensues if you don't watch the market in terms of what is available at the time in terms of price and quantity. And that's where the equilibrium is so important. Likewise, if you have a lower price as a result of some other aspect that's taking place, and again, we'll talk much more about this in chapter 4, but the idea here is it can create a shortage. If the price is beneath the the equilibrium at supply and demand, you have more that's demanded than is supplied. Suppliers don't want to sell at that price. They'd rather sell at equilibrium. But if the government is imposing a price control, for instance, to sell it at 75 cents versus $1, suppliers are going to hold back. They're going to hold off on this. And we've seen OPEC do this. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries have done this. They basically held back on their oil supplies because the prices are too low. They don't want to sell at that particular price point. They want to wait. So that's what leads to a shortage. More consumers in the marketplace want the product. There's more demand for it, to the tune of 2.4 billion pounds demanded. But there's a shortage because suppliers aren't supplying at those prices. They don't want to give it away. And that is what's critical here in creating the shortage. So some increases in demand in terms of what we see here. We're going to look at some key graphs that demonstrate this. But this is an increase in demand. Something is happening to merit a shift in demand. Maybe it's taste and preference. Maybe it's number of consumers in the marketplace. Maybe it's income that is changing, but it's shifting the demand curve rightward or outward. And notice it is leading us from an equilibrium at E1 to a new equilibrium at E2. The demand curve shifts, but supply curve doesn't change. So while the demand curve, all of the points on the demand curve shift to this new D2, supply is just moving along the curve from E1 to E2. This is leading us to a higher price level and a greater quantity, as what we'll see. And again, we'll demonstrate this in the key graph here in just a moment. But that's a shift in demand and the impact it has on price and on quantity as a result of that meriting a shift in demand in that situation. Now, if there's a decrease in supply, technology has let us down. There's a virus coming around and it's impacting all kinds of technology and slowing down our supply line. That's leading to a shift in supply. Notice demand is moving along the curve. There's no shift in demand here. It's just supply that's taking place. But the demand is moving along the curve from E1 to E2. This is leading to a higher price level and a smaller quantity that is being produced. So with the technological glitches, less product being produced, and they're now selling what product is being produced at a higher price because of this movement along the demand curve to that higher price level. Now, we're going to have some situations where we're going to see demand and supply both shifting, and I'll talk about that here in a second. Again, keep your eye on what is happening in those situations in terms of equilibrium, because that's going to determine what's happening with price, what's happening with quantity. And sometimes they will cancel each other out, as we'll see here in just a second. So supply curve shifting rightward or outward. Technological innovation in the 1970s is a good example here. Notice the supply curve is shifting. Demand is moving along the curve from E1 to E2, and the price is now falling, leading to a greater quantity and a lower price. So as a result of this technology in the 1970s, we have more supply and we're able to do it at a lower price point, but produce more quantity as a result of this. And this is where innovation and new technologies really help to make things better, more quantity and cheaper and more innovative as a result of this. So it's the movement along the curve, movement along the demand curve that is leading us to this lower price level, but at a greater quantity in terms of what we see here. Likewise, if we have a decrease in supply, notice that we have demand is increasing. More people want it. Taste and preferences through the roof. But supply is decreasing. What we're going to see for the most part isn't this large increase in demand and small decrease in supply. We're not going to see as much of that in AP College Board world, because usually if there's a demand curve shifting or a supply curve shifting, they're doing it in the same amounts. Krugman goes into a little more detail here in terms of these shifts. That's more on the college level. And when you take a higher level course in college in economics, you may take a look at these in terms of those aspects. But for the College Board purposes, when we talk about an increase in demand or a decrease in supply, they're moving at the same pace. So we're going to see those paces moving very similarly as a result. And again, same thing here. Large decrease in supply, small increase in demand. What we're looking at, and the key graphs are really going to be most helpful for this and significant, because when we see an increase in demand and we see a decrease in supply, they're going to be moving at the same level so that you can make an easier assumption as to what's actually happening in that marketplace. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this slide, but I want to introduce it here because I want to show you that there is a situation where the author of the textbook calls it ambiguous or indeterminate. Okay, indeterminate is the other term we use here, and the reason for that is because sometimes if you have two curves that are moving, one of the price or quantity is going to be indeterminate or ambiguous as a result. So we put a question mark there, and you'll see this in the key graphs here in just a moment. So let's take a look first at key graph 6. Again, all of these key graphs should be in your notebook, so make sure you go back through the key graphs to get them all. But the idea here is we want to see what's happening to price and quantity as a result of this demand curve shift. So what merits a shift in demand? The demand curve is shifting here, movement along the curve from E to E1, leading to a higher price level and a greater quantity. Notice we've also created a legend out here, just so that we can quickly take a look, and you should always do this, so you can quickly take a look and see price is increasing, quantity is increasing as a result of this demand curve shift. So this increase in demand leads to a higher price level and a greater quantity because of the demand curve shift. Now, let's look at a situation in which key graph 7, the demand curve is actually shifting leftward or inward. Something has happened. Recession leads to a lower incomes, and people are using inferior goods. Their income is inferior. They're laid off, or they don't have as much work, so they're not buying the way they were before. This is a demand curve that's shifting leftward or inward, and that's leading the supply curve to move along the curve from E to E1, leading to a lower price level and a smaller quantity. And our legend out here shows a smaller price level and a smaller quantity as a result of this. So demand curve shifting inward is going to lead to a decrease in demand. That's going to cause price and quantity both to fall as a result of this. Let's look at supply then. In key graph 8, we have the idea here of a supply curve shifting to the right from S to S1, demand moving along the curve, leading to a lower price level. Again, technology is changing our lives. It's leading us to produce more quantity and to do it at a lower price. So price is falling, quantity is increasing due to this shift in supply, and again, demand moves along the curve. In key graph 9, we have supply but moving in the other direction. Maybe the technology wasn't all that we thought it would be. There are problems, there are bugs, there are bigger issues need to be addressed. This is leading the supply curve to shift leftward or inward. Demand again moving along the curve from E to E1, leading to a higher price and a smaller quantity. It's more expensive what we are able to produce, and we're not able to produce nearly as much of it. So this shift in the supply curve to the left is leading to a higher price and a smaller quantity. In key graph 10, we're going to start to see now two shifts, what we call simultaneous shifting of supply and demand at the same time. Notice all of these are going to be moving at the same level, at the same pace. So one doesn't shift smaller than the other, as I mentioned in those key graphs we were looking at from the textbook author. The idea here is if supply is shifting outward, and demand is shifting outward or rightward, they're shifting at the same length. They're shifting at the same difference distance. This is ceteris paribus, okay? We will, and you may do this in college where you look in greater detail at how much, the degree to which they shift. We're not doing that here. College Board assumes if they're shifting outward, they're shifting at the same pace. So if supply is shifting outward and demand is shifting outward, they're shifting at the same pace, leading to something that's indeterminate. Anytime you have two curves shifting, you're going to have something that is ambiguous or indeterminate, and we use a question mark in the legend to outline this. You can see it, in this case it is price. If they're both moving in the same direction, it's price that's going to be impacted here. So quantity is increasing. So demand is shifted rightward, supply is shifted rightward, taste and preference is up, the technology is greater, so everything's moving forward. Price indeterminate, but we know the quantity is actually going to be greater here in this example, even though price is ambiguous. In key graph 11, we see here that the idea here, this should say P1, P2, and I apologize for that. The idea is supply curve shifting leftward or inward, demand also shifting leftward or inward. Again, price is going to be ambiguous, quantity is going to fall. So P1 and P2 here, quantity is falling, price is indeterminate or ambiguous as a result of this, we use a question mark in the legend. So this is when you have supply and demand both decreasing or shifting leftward or inward, you would have a price that's indeterminate, but a quantity that is falling. In key graph 12, then, we're moving in opposite directions. So we're looking at quantity now that is indeterminate. So supply curve shifting rightward, we've got new technologies, but the taste and preference is that people don't want it, or maybe there aren't as many consumers to take it to. So this is going to lead to a price that falls, but a quantity that's indeterminate. We don't know if that supply curve shifting in technology is going to be greater or less than the demand that's shifting leftward or inward. So we're assuming, again, they're moving at the same pace. So as a result of this, we see a quantity that is ambiguous or indeterminate in this particular situation. And that leads us to our last key graph, which is key graph 13. We're going to shift these curves in the other directions. So technology has not been our friend, or we had government taxes going up. As a result, supply curve shifting inward. But we have more consumers out there in the marketplace, and there's more income in the marketplace in terms of making this happen. So demand curve shifting rightward, supply curve shifting leftward. This is going to lead to a higher price. If supply curve is shrinking and moving inward, but demand curve is moving outward, we can see that there's less quantity on the supply side, but demand is increasing. So we're going to net, it's indeterminate as to what the quantity will be higher or lower. We're going to assume that it's probably at the same pace. They kind of cancel each other out. That's the idea of indeterminate. But we know that the price is going to be going up because more people want it and there's less of it out there. That's going to lead to an increase in the price of this particular good, even though the quantity is indeterminate. Okay, and that wraps up this chapter for supply and demand. Again, we'll look at price controls and looking at the idea of surplus and shortages. What impact does that have on price and quantity in the next chapter, which I think you'll enjoy. But here's some key terms to take a look at. If you don't know all of these key terms or how to apply them, more importantly, how to apply them, then you might want to go back in the text and take a closer look at the text there in terms of being able to address them and then apply them to some of the scenarios that we looked at in this chapter 3 overview. But I think that will serve you well and will help you in terms of preparing for upcoming quizzes and other assessments. Applying it to your business, something to think about. If you could open up any type of business in the world, what would it look like? What would it feel like? What would you produce? What would your upward sloping supply curve look like? What role would it play there? What would your downward sloping demand curve be like? And where would you be shifting your curves? Where would demand and supply be shifting as a result of what you see there? So think about that in terms of what price points would I want to be able to buy and sell at? What government actions would I want the government to take or not take in terms of applying it to my business? And how would that affect my business in terms of a perfectly competitive market? That's the role that we play here. One last thing I want to mention is just some activities that may help you in looking at these shifting curves versus movement along the curves and some scenarios that take place. Under modules on My MCPS Classroom, you'll see some of these activities. This is activity 1-4. It's looking at demand curves and movement along the demand curve versus shifts in the demand curve, which is a great activity to take a look at. To get a feel for when does it move along the curve versus shift the demand curve itself. Again, what merits a shift in demand. We have activity 1-5, which is looking at changes in demand, again, versus moving along the curve versus a shift of the curve. And then we have supply, looking at the same type of thing in 1-6 and 1-7. When do supply curves move versus shifts in the supply curve versus movement of quantity supplied? And what are some of the reasons for changes in those supplies? So 1-6 and 1-7, also a couple of really good activities for you to do. 1-8 then puts it all together like we did here with key graphs 5 through 13, looking at equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity, and how do we, when curves are shifting, what is happening to price and quantity based on that? So activity 1-8 is also worth your time to take a look at that. And then if you need some practice on shifting curves and what happens here, activity 1-9 is also a great resource for that in terms of looking at shifts in supply and demand demand and what's happening to price and quantity as a result of some scenarios that you can play out here, which are some really good activities that will help you in terms of types of questions you would see. Because Mr. Rodman always says, when in doubt, graph it out. Okay, and that leads to the last one, which is kind of a reiteration of 1-9, but this is 2-1, looking at some of the effects of demand and supply on the marketplace and how that impacts equilibrium quantity and supply as a result of that. I hope you found this helpful. I want to show you the take-home quiz questions from the multiple choice. Just put them up on the screen here for a moment so you can look through those. I will be posting the answers with explanations as I have in the previous chapters. And so that way you can look through those and bring any questions with you to class if you have them. And of course, as always, feel free to email me or reach out if there's any questions that you have that we can help clarify. Student support, don't forget, from 3 to 3:30-ish each day, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, which is also a great resource for you to get questions answered and get clarification on issues that you may have. So I hope you found this helpful. We will see you once again in Chapter 4, and have a great day. Good luck on that upcoming assessment, and again, we'll see you in Chapter 4.